We do have the benefit of simultaneous translation, but of course our translators do appreciate when you can speak slowly so they can translate accurately. So if you're on the mic, just a reminder to speak slowly so our translators can do their job well. So with that, I would like to introduce Alice Munyua, who is our moderator for this session. Alice?
Thank you very much, Karen, and good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to this session that's looking at harnessing the Internet for economic transformation. My name is Alice Munyua. I come from Kenya, a country that is, has become quite well known now in the ICT and Internet community for creating opportunities, applications, new business models, policies and regulations to help us overcome our own local constraints that enable us to contribute to what is slowly becoming a vibrant and robust Internet ecosystem at the local level. That in turn, of course, continues to contribute to transformation, social, economic, and of our political landscape. So this session is going to be exploring, discussing, and reflecting, as well as sharing experiences on the tremendous potential for supporting local-grown Internet-enabled services and trade. And we shall explore approaches to catalyzing local entrepreneurs and innovation that contribute to the transformation from creating it from Internet consumers to Internet creators, basically from aid to trade. We also hope to discuss and share broader opportunities and challenges for harnessing the Internet for social economic transformation, as well as the panel here, from the experiences and cross-sectoral experiences here that will be sharing lessons from successful initiatives, ventures and approaches, and what is also happening at the moment. We are going to be sharing that. And I wish to call upon the very distinguished panel here to introduce themselves and provide a perspective on what economic transformation means, their own perspective. And I would like to start with Michael Kende, there from Analysys Mason. Michael.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you to the Internet Society for this invitation to this quite amazing event. It's been very interesting, and I'm sure this panel will be quite illuminating as well. My name is Michael Kende. I'm a partner with Analysys Mason, a strategy consulting company. And I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the concept and the implications of leapfrogging. So it's often talked about that in emerging markets have leapfrogged, where mobile services have effectively leapfrogged fixed services, and you have a lot more mobiles than fixed in emerging countries, and that's because it costs much less to deploy mobile networks. It's easier to get competition going, and let's face it, the demand is much stronger for a mobile phone that you can personalize and take with you. So that's all good and well known, but I think the same is true for services. That you can have leapfrogging for services, and one of the best known examples is M-Pesa in mobile money. Now has 14 million subscribers in Kenya, representing 73% of all adults. So clearly, in terms of mobile access to money, Kenya has leapfrogged all developed countries. And the reason for that is similar in a sense to the mobile leapfrogging, that you just have people who don't have access to banks, to ATMs, to credit cards, and so it's a very low-cost and efficient way to provide banking services to people. And so this ability to leapfrog, not just in the access, but in the services, has two strong implications. One of those is that there's a strong possibility for innovation, for economic transformation in these services, that services like M-Pesa can be developed and start to be exported, and that's certainly the case with M-Pesa that's being rolled out around Africa. Another nice example that I like is a service called Usha that developed in Kenya after the there was some violence after elections in 2007. So they developed this application to track violence throughout the country using crowdsourcing and mobile maps. And that's started to be exported around the world where there's earthquakes or other disasters. And even in Washington, D.C., the Washington Post used it to track the snowplows after a big snowfall in 2010. I didn't know about it at the time, but if you live in Washington, you need to know where it's been plowed because the snow plows can be quite slow. So that's a nice example of an innovative service that was created for one need but started to be exported. But the other implication of this leapfrogging is that a mobile phone and access to the internet is even more valuable in emerging countries than they are here in the developed world, where we have access to banking, we have access to fixed phones, we have access to a lot of sources of information. Farmers can get access to crop prices here without going to the internet. So, you know, these phones have even more benefit. Mobile and the web has even more benefit in these emerging countries. And so that really leads to what I'd like to add to this panel is to talk about the need for infrastructure, because at the end of the day, you can't leapfrog the need for infrastructure to get mobile phones to people, to get access to people. And in a few minutes after this, I'd like to talk about a report that I've just done for the Internet Society on a particular piece of the infrastructure called the Internet Exchange Points. But just in terms of economic transformation, I'd just like to close with one other story that I always think about. And this is, again, around 2007 in Kenya when the iPhone came out. Somebody, you know, a guy there, a young man there, downloaded the software developer kit, created an application for the iPhone, put it on the market and started to sell it. Nothing special except for the fact that he'd never seen or touched an iPhone. And so you imagine the drive and the imagination to create an app, put it on the web, having never tried an iPhone, having never tested it on an iPhone. And I think that for me, the economic transformation is making sure that guy has an iPhone, making sure he has the tools to be able to compete, and then letting him get onto the world market just like everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'd now like to call upon Gbenga Sesan, please.
Okay, so economic transformation is when you look at it really, when you look at the economics of it, it's quite interesting. But when you extend it a bit and talk about real socioeconomic transformation, I find that particularly exciting for two reasons. One is the fact that the internet itself is basically a leveler. You know, it just makes everything possible. I always give the example of the fact that, I mean, something as simple as news. A few years ago, if anything happened anywhere else in the world, for me to get that information, I would have to wait for the news the next day. But right now, if anything is happening anywhere, I have access to it. And it's the same thing with opportunities. So I work in rural areas in Nigeria, and I work with a lot of young people who naturally do not have access to opportunities. But guess what? Because of the internet, they can as well get access to exactly the same amount of information that anyone, anywhere else in the world can have access to. So yes, they may not have access to quality education. Yes, they may not have access to quality information about how to run their own businesses or how to get jobs and all that. But then, because of the internet, they can, leap over that problem. And when I think of economic transformation, I want to bring this down to the context of Africa as a continent. For example, the youth population, the average age for the continent, for Africa, is 19. It's a very young continent. And one of the things that tells us is that there's a youth bulge. Young people are increasing. Well, guess what? There are no jobs. So it means that one of the opportunities that we have, because there are two things that can happen. We saw the protests in the Middle East, we saw the protests in North Africa. The reason why that was led by young people and why many of that will still happen is because a lot of these young people don't have economic opportunities. And by the way, one of the advantages of the internet, as in terms of harnessing the internet for economic opportunities or for transformation, is the fact that On the internet, a lot of young people are able to see what is possible in other countries. And that is quite interesting because it changes the dynamics. So if your government says, oh, there are no jobs, we're going to create jobs in 10 years, you can actually see that in other countries, the same thing is being done, but it's being done faster. And let me just quickly, tell the story of two young people that we work with in Nigeria. One of them is called Famous. Famous was told by his dad, after he had studied for a while, he had gone through primary school, he had gone through secondary school, and his dad told him, you know what, you've done enough. I've spent some money on you, but right now, what I need to do is have you stop your education so I can pay for your younger sister to also go to school. Now, this was the reality. Now, so what was Famous going to do? Famous has just completed secondary school. Even if he had gone to universities to study, the chance that he would get a job after graduating is about 10%. So right now, his chance of getting a job is way less than 10%. But then Famous got introduced through a project to learning how to use the internet, learning how to use a computer, and he applied for an internship. And guess what? He got an internship with the UK Deputy High Commission in Lagos because he could do data entry. After a while, he saw a job opening at the UK High Commission, the UK Embassy in Abuja. And when he told me he was going to apply, I was kind of like, I know you're ambitious, we tell you to be ambitious, but, even if you're a graduate, this could be a bit difficult, but go ahead. He applied for this, and he got the job. After about 4 months, he had earned enough money for him to go to school. He resigned, went to school, he graduates later this year. Now, the reality is that Famous is not the only one whose life has been transformed. His family would also benefit from that. And how did that happen? Simply because he got access to the internet, he was able to get information, and of course, information would always empower you. I'll stop here. I was going to tell you the story of how Esther literally got physically transformed because she got access to the internet. She looked literally, physically different because she had gained a lot of confidence. This was a young woman who was scared of being tempted to do one or two things. But right now, because she has access to the internet, she's able to get information, and she knows that because of what she has learned, she's not only able to change her own life, she's not only able to change, the life of our family members, but she's beginning to mentor other younger women. And that, I think, is the reality of using the internet for economic transformation.
Thank you very much, Gbenga. Kathryn Brown, please.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you to the Internet Society for inviting me to this important panel. I'm delighted to be here with Alice, who, as many of you know, has become an amazing leader in East Africa, and it's always a pleasure to be with her. Verizon, I am a Senior Vice President at Verizon for Policy Development and Corporate Responsibility. Verizon is a large infrastructure company. We build networks. We build networks in the United States and around the world. In the United States, we have one of the largest fiber-to-the-home networks, and we also are the first in the world to deploy a nationwide LTE wireless network. So our network is both wired and wireless and integrated in the U.S. Around the world, we are one of the largest connectors of the planet. We have 485,000 route miles of network that traverse the seas, connect 6 continents, 180,000 businesses, and over which best efforts internet traffic flows. I don't think folks understand our place in the internet space as well as I wish they did, but it's the investment in these networks that connect the world that have enabled the kind of connectivity, the kind of presence that the internet has both in the Western world, the Eastern world, the Southern world, all over the world at this point. One of, I think, the major happenings of the last year, 2 years, was in fact the connection that happened for East Africa. Once the undersea cables were connected to Mombasa, the whole of East Africa changed economically. And that's what I hope we're going to be able to talk about today. It was that connectivity, that ability to to drive down the cost of connection, the cost of transporting that data instead of north and south, but directly to the source, to the place where we wanted the message to go. That has driven down the cost of connectivity, the cost of bandwidth for the whole part of East Africa. I think it is a lesson and a prescription for where we have to go in the future. And as we develop our thoughts on this panel, I hope we can pay attention to what this deployment of infrastructure really does for transformation. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, Kathy. I would like to call Freddy Torres, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. I'm going to speak some seconds to the people to put their headphones. Mi nombre es Freddy Linares, soy director de Cominstall. Es una empresa consultora que tenemos base en Lima y Miami. ¿Sí? Mi enfoque no va a estar basado principalmente en el tema de infraestructura. En los países
on the infrastructure, should the Andean region countries basically share a number of features that are quite common. Peru has an internet penetration rate, there's about 30 million inhabitants, and we have approximately 10.5 or 10 million internet users. So the use of the internet within this context is still quite low. We still have a large part of our population which is starting to take part in these this content space, these commercial and transactional spaces. But what I wish to highlight in this forum is the scenario that is created when one of these schools or towns starts having access to the internet and starts identifying opportunities linked to the use of internet. I'd like to provide two concrete examples in the academic sphere. One is, let's call him Ronald. He's a teacher in Cusco. Cusco is a quite well-known town in a city in Peru. We have some of the most important archaeological ruins there called Machu Picchu. This professor has this school has 4 or 5 classrooms with approximately 50 students. He uses the internet through his own initiative in his classrooms, and he seeks he looks for content on the internet and content linked to the internet in order to develop together with his students different opportunity scenarios which they may thereafter benefit from to make use of this medium in its social environment. Many of the workers in these, many people in these rural areas end up working in manufacturers, in the manufacturing sector, in the very place they study at. So the possibility of providing opportunities by means of the access to knowledge and the internet is very important in these towns. If we go to the rainforest area and in the Andean region too, we have different kinds of geography. A school in Iquitos, this school shares a dial-up internet connection. In this case, the teacher, who is the equivalent of Ronald in Cusco, is far more limited and has far less time to cover his students' needs in terms of content, rich in information content for his students. In both cases, we have schools with an academic population that has similar needs, that is to find information very rapidly, to be able to access market information, to access news, online libraries, and other kinds of contents. But this infrastructural situation, which is quite well known in the Andean region countries, is a bottleneck, something we must pay attention to in order to contribute to the development of these regions. On the other hand, if we move towards the world of ideas, countries that are involved in the generation of ideas for starting new entrepreneurial initiatives have found a very interesting window of opportunities in order to start generating new commercial relations with other countries. Approximately 11 or 12 months ago, in some countries in the region, we started to see the presence of some development funds for the development of these very ideas. This kind of previously, so the financial backup was always of the same kind. Someone would have a business plan, a project, would go to the bank, and they would have to have their use their house as a guarantee. But this has changed radically. Now we have far more activity linked to new ideas with new features in terms of team and equipment and analysis of the business proposal. But we have seen emerge in sort of a mini culture and entrepreneurial environment that is quite interesting. In one of the last initiatives of one of our regional funds, there was a very large difference in the region in terms of proposals linked to the internet that were presented. And at the moment, the relationship between the company and university, how you move from an idea to an actual product is getting closer. There has been a regretful distance in the past between university and business, but increasingly we see a closer relationship emerge. So it is the same, the very researchers who identify what post-research value their initiatives may have.
La valeur que peut représenter ces initiatives, par exemple. Merci beaucoup, Freddy. J'aimerais maintenant donner la parole à Vincent. Merci beaucoup, Alice, et merci à l'ISOC de m'avoir donné cette occasion de vous faire part d'un dossier qui risque d'être parmi les plus excitants de ma carrière. Il s'agit de l'investissement dans le média numérique en Afrique. J'ai créé eVentures pour l'Afrique en
venture capital in Europe. After an in-depth analysis of Africa during the years 2008 and 2009, a group of VCs and former internet entrepreneurs came together and decided to start off this venture. And we basically had 5 key reasons to be interested in doing so. First and foremost, it was mentioned already, the deployment scheme of the sea cables dedicated to prevent the digital divide, which was foreseen between 2009 and 2012, and I think we're pretty much on schedule in getting those sea cables connecting Africa. The second reason was what we saw in 2008 already, the massive growth in cell phone usage, and I think as of today it's always hard to get real market research, real reliable data on Africa, but I think today we're talking about over 600 million handsets in Africa on a population of 1 billion, which is obviously massive. A third and very important reason is what I refer to as the upcoming middle class. We tend to see, lots of people still tend to see Africa as a continent with just a handful of filthy rich people and lots of poverty, which obviously is still there. But look at the traffic jams in Nairobi, the traffic jams in Lagos, in Ghana, and you get a sense of the amount of people actually who can afford a car these days, and that is such a sign. Most important to us in setting up this fund was a phenomenon that is often described as the return of the cheetahs. High-educated native Africans having studied abroad, having made their careers either in the UK, Canada, the US, that are now very often returning to the continent and setting up all kinds of businesses, and lots of them in the digital media space. Last but not least is what we refer to as the funding gap in the middle. There is ample microfinance available all over Africa. Private equity is, as we speak, flowing in. It has got something to do, I guess, also with the relative risk of Africa, which is rapidly changing, also looking at the state of the economy in the West. But what has so far been hardly addressed is what is referred to as that funding gap in the middle. The typical venture capital fund size of amounts between maybe 100,000 to, let's say, $2.5–5 million. That is just not out there, or slowly beginning. That is the gap that our fund is addressing, and obviously we focus on sub-Saharan Africa, and we're very keen to focus on what we refer to as finding African solutions for African issues. It is tempting to copy, with all the lessons learned of 20 years of internet in the West, to just go in there and copy-paste the Monsters, the Amazons, the eBays of the West. And yes, there is a market for those platforms and applications. But I'm fascinated about the amount of applications we get that have that typical African twist. Obviously, most of these apps are mobile-centric, which you can all see. And we see more and more video applications and platforms also. Just to give you a small indication, I think that since we started our fund, January 2010, we've been receiving over 500 applications from all over Africa. There's often the issue on talking about venture capital. Is this commercially driven or is it impact investing? I think that's a funny discussion. If it's commercially sound, you create lots of impact. And we love the fact that we create more and more high-value jobs. And if you know Africa or you know emerging countries, you know what the impact of creating those kinds of jobs in those economies is. Personal note is, I can't prove it by research, but it's a gut feeling that has led me to do this, is that internet access in Africa will mean more for the economic development of the continent than 300 years of Catholic mission and 60 years of development aid. And why am I saying that? Because we see so much impulses on e-learning, on business enabling, but even on e-government and transparency that comes with that. Last but not least, what I like most is the self-confidence you encounter when you're holding, and we do that like every month, Dragon's Den-like sessions in Nairobi, in Accra, in Lagos, the self-confidence of these young entrepreneurs that don't want to be dependent on what kind of form of aid. They just want to set up a business, and that's what makes us tick. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. Dr. Usha, please.
Thank you, Alice, for inviting me here. I'm a social scientist, and I have worked with all technologies, starting with radio and television in the 70s to internet and to mobile learning and mobile applications today. And my work has not been only in India, it has been in the Asia-Pacific region, in teaching, research, evaluation, and as a practitioner. So I'm drawing upon that many years of experience and also the more recent experience of the Asia Pacific to draw attention to some of the issues that I consider very pertinent to this session. First of all, I have a great deal of discomfort with the term economic, because transformation is not merely about economic transformation. I believe transformation is a wider term, and economics is but one subset or subpart of it. And so I would like to look at the internet and what this means in terms of transformation, particularly in the Asia-Pacific world. I'm equally uncomfortable with terms like emerging, developing, third world, aspiring nations. I don't know what we're emerging from. I don't know what we're developing toward. I don't know why we are called the third world. And I don't know what we are aspiring toward. So I'm very uncomfortable with these terms. So I will try not to use them. What I'm trying basically to say is, what I have seen over the years is that older technologies such as television opened a window to the world. The internet is a game changer. It has opened a window to opportunities that people can use. I'll give you 3 very small cameos, which I have done through research. A young woman studying in a government school, learning English the hard way, finishes school on a scholarship, graduates on a scholarship, learns the ropes in an Indian call center, and now works for a multinational call center, earning 10 times as much as her father used to earn, hardly 5 years ago. Another young girl provides virtual executive assistant services to people in the US or UK. A third young woman, also emerging from what we call a first-generation literate family, today provides online tutoring in mathematics and science to students in the US. A group of illiterate or semi-literate women in a rural area in Haryana provide call center services to the rest of the country. Why did I choose women's cases? I chose these cases because the transformation is most visible here. They have pulled themselves and their families out of poverty. They have enabled the education of their siblings. The young woman who provides online tutoring is now doing her master's and is likely to get a job even before she finishes it. What made this possible? What made this possible in countries like China, India, and the Philippines was essentially enabling and proactive legislation, deregulation, backed by other supports such as easy access to microfinance and to credit for startups and for small industries. It also led to an investment in education, not just in basic ICT literacy, but also in the specialized skills that are needed in order to run an IT-enabled services industry. Perhaps which is why 32 to 35% of ITES services are located in India. These are World Bank facts. And 52% or more of the IT consulting and R&D is located between the cities of Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, Chennai, and Delhi. The point, however, is that India and China benefit from what we call the economies of scale. For us, 1 million is a small number. And therefore, we are able to provide opportunities at the same cost to a larger number of people. Infrastructure has certain fixed costs. It doesn't drop down below that. If more people benefit, your per unit cost comes down. But what I've seen in the Asia Pacific is that countries like Maldives, countries like Fiji, countries like Mongolia, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, and several others suffer from what we might call the diseconomies of scale. Small populations, sparsely populated, and therefore find it very difficult to get the economic resources needed to put the infrastructure and put the investments in place. So how does one address this diseconomies of scale? When we look at worldwide examples, we find that in the East Caribbean, the smaller leeward countries came together in order to break the monopoly of cable and wireless, so that they increased the size of the domestic market by coming together in a common market. We find that islands like Cape Verde, where they have very small populations, led transformation by behavior change rather than by technological determinism. And so therefore we find a variety of examples where the transformation is taking place. Fiji got its fiber optic not because it was particularly politically significant, but because, to put it bluntly, the Americans needed a junction point for the fiber optic cables running through the South Pacific through their own territories. And that's as important as anything else. But when I say all of this about the transformative power of the internet, I would also like to draw your attention as a social scientist to the downsides, some things that we're seeing that are very, very disturbing to us. While there are changes in economics and more people are living better, there are changes in physical illnesses that are related to what we call computer-related injuries, hearing impairments. We're finding lifestyle diseases of diabetes, stress in these working conditions much more. We're finding changes in the family structure and patterns of communication that used to take place in the authority structures in a home. These are all being challenged. More important, we're finding changes in the cognitive styles of how children learn and how children pay attention. The attention span of a 10-year-old child has come down to less than 3 minutes. So how do you teach a child mathematics in an attention span of 3 minutes? These are very serious concerns we are facing. And so what is missing then? I think in order for us to understand the real transformative impact of the internet, which is visible, but is not documented by very, very solid on-the-ground research. And I think it is imperative upon all of us to get that research, to validate whatever it is that we are trying to say from solid research rather than anecdotal evidence of the kind that I have given you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Usha. Jacques, please.
Thanks, Alice. Just one word. I've been in McKinsey for about 20 years now, and I remember the first innovation that came across my desk at that time was the voicemail system. It took, again, 2 years because I was in Canada and the US at that time to get an internet connection. And finally, the internet was rolled out across the firm 1 year later in Europe. So imagine a world before the internet and now. Obviously, I don't have to make a picture out of it, but obviously a lot of things have changed since. And the internet has been, at least for me, to the good and to the best. Now, interestingly, the reason why I'm here is as a person working a lot with clients across the world in telecom, media, and high-tech, one of the questions we got a lot is, how do I transform myself as a company? And taking a related question to it, if you look at the internet, most of the statistics you got on the internet or the web as one of the platforms on the internet, it's a lot of metrics about consumer success, i.e. there are billions of people going daily on the web, or you get statistics on Google saying at least 1 billion users are going onto a Google front page every day and things like that. That's good to measure a consumer surplus. The question is, how do I get those numbers to work out to define a transformation and transformations that leads to progress? Now, obviously, as a private company, we're not necessarily looking at all the elements of transformation, i.e. social transformation, things like that. They definitely are important. But again, for us, it's quite important to understand the economic transformation and try to understand that from how the technology internet diffuses into the economy to transform economies and translate possibly in some numbers of economic activity. Again, economic activities are is only one metric, but it's a metric today which is not necessarily well defined, and at least we don't have tangible data about how big the internet is and how much does it contribute to the growth of economies as an indicator of wellness. Having done the work both for the G20 and, for lack of better word, for the aspiring countries, we came to staggering numbers. The first one is that if you take and you explode these numbers across the full world, you come to say that the internet economy today, broadly defined, is possibly a 5 trillion economic activity. So we're not talking about revenue here, we talk about added value. First digital divide, however, is that, like usual, the G20 is possibly 40% of that total pie, and the rest is obviously distributed across a lot of countries, of which you can still split and say, well, the BRIC countries still going to have 40% of the remainder of this 5 trillion and so on. So there's a long tail of economic contribution linked to the internet in the first place. Second observation, if you look at this, at the data, is that if you look deep into them, it's not about the supply side. The supply side is very important, i.e. having infrastructure providers, having service providers, making the internet build-up for which you to use. It's actually when companies are using the technology to transform themselves, transform their business model, that we see the bulk of the economic growth. Again, to take an example or to paraphrase Dr. Reddi, the fact that some call center companies decide to extend the way they will offer their services to remote call center activities and the like, and use the technology to expand their business models, is what I'm talking about. And again, the surprising thing, which is the second digital divide, if you like, is that if you look at companies worldwide and companies between the developed world and the aspiring world, the staggering fact is that as much as we as consumers, we use a lot of technologies, a lot of companies, yes, they have invested in email services and possibly have web server for you to host some of your documents, but those technologies are not yet integrated in digital processes. Our statistics tell us that in developed countries, barely 20 to 30% of companies are investing sufficiently in internet technologies and benefit from these technologies to transform their business models. If you take the developing countries, the numbers are namely much lower, in the range of 10 to 15%, i.e. 85% of the companies are not yet using, beside a simple access of the technologies, are using the benefit of technologies linked to the internet to transform themselves and go to new markets, for instance. That's the second observation I wanted to share with you. The third one is still in terms of the numbers. We see surprising things because does the internet, even if it's transformed some sectors, is it only disruptive? In one way, yes, it is. We've seen that in the media industry, which I serve very well. But in many cases, it's actually additive and disruptive in the sense of is doing the goods for the sector. What we find out, for instance, is that in most of the sectors, for one employment destroyed or reallocated because of the internet technologies within companies, pretty much 2.6 jobs are created, simply because it opens new ways of creating added value. And again, this number is for the developing countries, so for the developed countries. The staggering digital divide in the other sense is that in developing countries or aspiring countries, we start to see much more 3 to 5 jobs created for one which is basically displaced. So the factor, the multiplier of employment in aspiring countries is actually much bigger, and basically it's a sign of catch-up, or at least a sign of blowback, if you like, from the developing aspiring countries to the other countries. Now, why are these numbers quite important for us? As I said, the very first one is to say economic activity matters. Because if you don't have growth in economic activities, by definition, it's very difficult to take people out of the poverty trap. So here we see the internet itself is today big and contributes in many cases between 10 to 20% of the economic growth in all the countries we have analyzed. Possibly more in the 20% range, i.e. in the high end in countries like Sweden and the US, possibly much more in the low end, 3 to 5% in some of the developing countries, with exceptions. If you take Vietnam, if you take Taiwan, all these countries we have analyzed, it's already 20%. But the point here is to say it's good because it contributes to growth. Second point is that it's good to have consumer surplus. It's good to have people using technologies. But the fundamental element for economic transformation and for social transformation is to make sure people can live with it. It's actually a living factor. And to get the living factors, you need entrepreneurship, you need new companies, you need companies to transform themselves to the benefit of creating more employment. And what we find out is that don't be scared. There will be reallocation of jobs, but most of the time it's actually for the benefit of growth. Now, if there is growth at the country level, comes the question, is it just a competition game between countries, or a competition games between good companies adopting and bad companies or poor companies not adopting? Now, what we find out is that, in general, 50% of the economic driver of this transformation is actually more trading activities and much more international trade activities starting to going on, which in most of the cases we know in international trade, this is not substitutive but additive. So again, there, an interesting element. How do we make sure that the transformation at the level of each of the enterprise is happening to the benefit of international trade, which itself will reinforce the virtuous cycle to the benefit of the aspiring countries? Stopping here, the themes I would like to make clear in my discussion to the panel is that, yes, it's important to talk about infrastructure. Yes, it's important to talk about how people are using, on the other side of the spectrum, the technologies. But in between, what we find out is how do we make sure that at the end of the day, these technologies are co-processed within enterprise or the industrial structure to make sure that they create new economic activities which benefits the population of these aspiring countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacques, and thank you each panelist for those introductory remarks. I think I want to go back to each one of you with questions, and feel free to respond to each other's questions. One interesting factor, especially for my region, the recent Kenyan statistics, for example, put Kenyan access to mobile telephony at nearly 76% at the moment. We are nearly 26 million. And currently a nearly 22% increase in internet subscribers, and 99% of those access the internet using mobile phones. So I think we'd be interested to find out what can be done to increase access to the internet using mobile phones, and is mobile access sufficient, or is shared infrastructure the means to increase the internet? I think I would like to hear from Michael, from Kathryn Brown, and from all of you thank you.
Okay, I think we can divide this up. I know Kathy has an interest in talking about the spectrum and the issues with the mobile access, so I'll maybe talk about the backhaul and elaborate a little on the issues of the submarine cables that Verizon and other companies are bringing. And we just, so, there's a huge increase in the amount of submarine capacity into Africa. We ran some numbers showing that moving from satellite to submarine cable should lower the cost of broadband access, mobile broadband access, by about 50%. And I can, if you ask me afterwards, I can send you this study. And the result is that international capacity results in about 15% of the cost of mobile broadband access. So huge reduction from all of this new capacity. Then you need backhaul into the country. And that can still be quite expensive, and it's quite reliant on good regulations, liberalizing access to the submarine cables, providing competition on the fiber that hopefully is running through the country, or building that fiber. And then a last point I wanted to raise It relates to internet exchange points, and I just wanted to point out this study that my company's just completed with Internet Society called Assessment of the Impact of Internet Exchange Points, Empirical Study of Kenya and Nigeria, and there's some copies here, and you can download it from the Internet Society website. And really what this did, we looked at this particular piece of infrastructure and the impact that it's had, the economic impact in Kenya and Nigeria, and just to make sure everyone's on the same page about what an internet exchange point is and why it's used. In the early days of internet in pretty much every country, including countries in Europe, Asia, all over the world, typically ISPs always have to connect to the international internet to get access to the content, to get access to the internet. So what happens is typically they find it very cost efficient to use those international connections to exchange all traffic, meaning that you can be in a situation where you can send an email to someone across the street and it will go through another country and route back. And as I say, this is true everywhere. When I was at the FCC in the late 90s, we toured one of the big exchange points in Virginia, and we're told that 60% of European internet traffic went through that building in Virginia. Because it was so expensive to do domestic connections within Europe, everyone just threw the traffic to the US and routed it back. So obviously that's not very efficient in the long run. So typically ISPs will get together in a building, create an internet exchange point where they can exchange traffic with one another. And that happened across Europe to eliminate this problem of sending the traffic through Virginia. It happened in Asia. It happened all across the US. And now it's starting to happen in all the developing countries. And so we wanted to study and really put some numbers to the impact that this has had in these countries. And we found really 3 levels of impact. The first is that it immediately improves the performance of the internet. So if you're sending a packet from Nairobi to Europe or the US and back, that takes a long time and is probably very congested because it's so expensive. So we found that it reduces the latency from 600 milliseconds at a maximum down to about 2 at a minimum. Translated, that means that a voice-over IP call, a domestic voice-over IP call that sounded like walkie-talkies before because you'd had to wait for the response, suddenly becomes instantaneous and live, and you can do video chat and everything else. And the second thing is not using those international routes for domestic traffic saves a lot of money, and we estimated about 1.5 million in Kenya, 1 million in Nigeria, so huge cost savings. The second thing is that it becomes attractive to make content available there because you can put a cache or you can put a server near that IXP and have it accessible by everybody through one common infrastructure. And Google has been very aggressive in putting caches around Africa, including in Kenya and Nigeria, and they use it to store YouTube videos and other content, make it very accessible to users there. And the implication of that is quite interesting because we all know that if you're on a website and it takes too long to load, you give up and move on. So what happened is by putting the YouTube and all of this content near these IXPs and increasing the access, or lowering the latency and improving the performance, people started surfing a lot more, watching a lot more YouTube videos. Since most of these people were using a mobile phone that was charged by the megabit, that increased revenues for the operators because they were selling more access because people were watching more videos. And we estimated that at least $6 million of increased revenues to the mobile operators. So they're getting a great deal. Their costs are going down. Their revenues are going up. Other people start taking advantage of it. In Kenya, the Revenue Authority uses this IXP to lower the latency and start tracking customs and allowing people to file their taxes online. So it kind of snowballs. And then finally it can turn more regional where people from other countries will go to Kenya to access their YouTube videos rather than to Europe. So all in all, these great benefits from it. And the nice thing is, and I think consistent with some of the comments here, is that the government intervention to get all of these benefits is quite limited. You have to liberalize, make sure you have a good environment that people want to put content in. But for the most part, it's the ISPs working together to create this framework that's going to snowball and create a lot of benefits to make the mobile access much more affordable and much quicker and easier to use.
Thank you, Alice. So let's talk about mobility for a moment. So we know that the uptake of mobile devices, telephone for voice, was probably one of the fastest uptake of any technology that the world has ever seen. The game changer, of course, is broadband access through the mobile device. When the bandwidth now becomes large enough for the transmission of data and the transmission of internet data and of video, of course, the possibilities become huge. What is happening in the world today is that the technologies that will increase that bandwidth are getting better and better. So my introduction around the deployment of LTE in the United States, I purposely talked about this because here is a technology now that has increased your throughput tenfold. So we are seeing in the United States speeds of up to 7 to 15, 17 megabits in your hand on a mobile device, on a smartphone. And that's where density is, there's high density. We have found, and it's been documented, where there is lower density, we're seeing 30 to 50 megabits. Once you start getting that kind of speed in a mobile situation, you just start to think about the benefits that accrue. Not just YouTube videos, but of course applications in education, healthcare, etc. Now, there is a huge opportunity for leapfrogging, as has already been discussed, in those parts of the world where there have not been wireline networks, but there has been a proliferation of cell towers for wireless technology. The new technologies can be built on top of that infrastructure at a price that is a lot less expensive. It is competitive, so that the long haul that is required to get that traffic back to those points of presence is actually being built by private companies who want that traffic, who already see that customer base, and they know that that customer base is wanting the higher speeds, the newer technologies, the computing power that's in the new devices. So we're seeing the investment, that high investment in infrastructure that we've never seen before in the world because these technologies are so accessible. Now, to Jacques' point, what are they connected to? So last week we were over at the World Health Organization to talk about the benefits of these technologies in mobile health. The WHO just put out a very good report in mobile health. The doctor with whom I was speaking, however, said to me, what good is it if everybody has a phone in their hands if they cannot access the healthcare system, which has not, to Jacques' point, embraced ICT as a way to transform itself. So that if I have a phone in my hand that will do everything digitally, but the system itself is still papers and charts, it doesn't transform healthcare. So the economic transformation, the social transformation, I completely agree, happens when there is systematic integration of these technologies. And that the next phase in my view, the infrastructure issue is the foundational point at which we get this economic lift. We could talk about India 15 years ago before those undersea cables attached India to the rest of the world, and really what's happened there, everything that's been described, is based upon that connectivity. So to me, that's paramount. But once the connectivity happens, this idea of integration with the very systems and structures of business, of government, of healthcare, of education becomes the next very, very important step in achieving the transformation we know is possible. So, Alice, we can talk more about that, but I think that all those points come together that folks have made.
Thank you. Jacques, you had a comment, and then Gbenga as well.
Yeah, I was going to say pretty much what Kathryn just re-emphasized. From the infrastructure point of view, we all know that the technology of 3G is okay today, but it has to evolve given the bandwidth consumption grows. Now, the economics of LTE are such that at the end of the day, if you want to do a private ROI on this, pretty much you have to assume that it will be a good payback if you start today and you get a consumer to pay in, let's say, in real term, something between 3 and 5 euro per month. Now, for this 3 to 5 euro on the consumption side to come in developing countries, where pretty much 30 to 40% of the people live with 1 euro per month, the economics don't stack up. So the only way to get there is exactly what Kathryn has said. We need to get industries to basically invest this 5 euro that will translate in added value in new businesses, or government themselves who will basically make the business case of the transformation. And the good news, and again, Kathryn has done that point, but I will want to re-emphasize it, there are at least a few verticals, as we call it, or industrial sectors, where the payback is fascinating, simply because there is no distribution in most of Africa, for instance, or simply because the sectors have not yet benefited from the first wave of ICT. We talk about banking, we talk about utilities, we talk even in some of the service businesses, obviously we talk about healthcare. The beauty of the government spending the money today on, or education for that matter, we all know these sectors, whether you invest in technology or not, the fact that you invest creates huge spillover into the economy. If a population is wealthy, it is more productive. If you got a banking system, you got obviously much more trade potential. If you have power, obviously you can do many more things and so on. So it seems to me that one of the key driver, it's not infrastructure on the ICT, obviously it's important, but it's an interworking between the government and the infrastructure, and the sum of these two, the interaction of these two, will likely create fascinating leapfrogging elements to the benefit of these countries.
Thank you, Jacques.
Okay, so I see 4 opportunities here. One is the fact that there's currently a gap between the undersea cables have landed, but then, where is the internal connection, the inland connection, to actually take this huge access to the last, maybe not the last mile now, but to the end user. And what I'm beginning to see in a few African countries, and in Nigeria in particular, is that the telecom companies are beginning to particularly invest in inland infrastructure. And that, I think, is a huge opportunity, because at times when we talk about the undersea cables and see the maps and the pipes, the question is, oh my God, so where exactly, is this going to? But the second opportunity I see is in terms of the numbers. I just checked the numbers for Nigeria for February. And, considering where we're coming from, these numbers are interesting. There's 116.4 million connected mobile lines, 92 million active mobile lines. Yes, most likely some of these mobile phones, maybe 3 mobile phones to 2 people and all that. But these numbers, represent a major shift. She was referring to the problem with children's attention span earlier because of technology. And I remember that what I always talk about is the fact that we will actually eventually have to take this content to where the attention is. So, for example, one of the key questions I've been asking myself is, how can we compress mathematics, chemistry, and other subjects into okay, maybe 140 characters because of Twitter. Okay, but I think this is a major opportunity. A few years ago and even now, there will be the clash between what is and what is coming. But guess what? We can't do anything about it. It's here. And I think we need to embrace that. So I see new opportunities in education, in business, in healthcare, and in other areas. A third opportunity, which is quite interesting, is I'm sure everyone obviously has read the story of how RIM is going, the BlackBerry makers are going through some kind of turbulence globally. I saw two articles in Financial Times 2 weeks ago. One basically talked about this problem, and the other one talked about how RIM is striking gold in Lagos. Okay, and it's quite interesting because even though there's a story of sales decline in other places, but then it's become like a culture in Lagos and in Nigeria. It's interesting enough, there's actually a Nollywood movie titled Blackberry Babes, Part 1, and then Part 2. So, you know, there's this opportunity in markets that are beginning to appreciate the use of this. And I think, you know, finally is the fact that, yes, we don't want to stop at consumption, because consumption in itself is not the end of the story, but we're beginning to see shifts, and I'm sure that, you know, Vincent will see this in the people that apply to you. We're beginning to see shifts from just mere consumption to people who are beginning to clone. So there's the Nigerian Twitter, there's the Kenyan Facebook and all that, but now we're beginning to see a shift thanks to mobile, you know, platforms and opportunities to actually creating. So you're beginning to see relevant content being created thanks to the mobile opportunities. So I think these are 4 glaring opportunities when it comes to mobile and how it's being used. And of course, some of these things will mean radical shifts. So for example, in education, you know, I think that eventually the attention span has reduced, but it will keep reducing. So the content has to go where they are, maybe in 140, 160 characters.
All this points to me to one term: convergence. Convergence in infrastructure and hardware and devices, which enable us to breach that last mile connectivity problem. Convergence of different stakeholders, that is, of government with its policy-making function, of the industry with its ability to work very efficiently and effectively to achieve goals that government cannot, to educationists, to education and social sectors of development who are the potential users. I mean, who are, I would say, the gateway between government, the service providers, and the users. And so this is a convergence, one of technology, another of stakeholders, and 3 of a variety of disciplines. And its lines are getting so blurred that it's difficult to tell where the educational pedagogist who comes and looks at attention spans and says, how do I teach long division, you know, an attention span of 3 minutes. So it's a convergence of all of these. And it also means, I think the convergence also means that, that ultimately the user at the other end, whether it is a student, whether it is a grandmother, whether it is a child, determines which technology to use to access, to get access, and that all should be available. It's not just one or the other, all should be available. And it is in the regions of the greatest deprivation, such as Afghanistan, where you see the greatest opportunities for mobile applications, and particularly in health and education elsewhere. So, I mean, it's an evolving picture, it's dynamic, it's unpredictable, but it's very exciting.
Thank you. Now, in terms of, I think Gbenga has touched a little bit on that in terms of investment, you know, in upcoming, especially in the area of content, local content, and you know, other areas like e-government services and all that. I think I would like to ask Vincent and both Freddy and Gbenga, who are, you know, entrepreneurs. What are the challenges for entrepreneurs in both Africa and Latin America? Are there similarities or differences? And for Vincent, what are the typical high-impact areas from which you can expect the most impact? Yeah.
We've invested in one major local content platform so far, originally launched in South Africa, and in the past 6 to 9 months literally spreading all over Africa. It's active in 9 countries now, and basically in every country that it enters within 2, 3, 4 months, it has become the number 2 or number 3 in terms of eyeballs and traffic generation. What you quite often see is that, and I'm now referring to countries like Angola, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, that online content is dominated in all those countries. The top 10 websites that are addressed are Facebook, Google. It's the global players. And then after that top 10, what you see is that the dominant newspaper has a website. It's the typical website that we have seen back in the mid-90s, probably. There's virtually no digital advertising on those incumbent websites. So one of the challenges of this particular company, in order to become cash flow positive, which is, when you're active in venture capital, important, is to address the market of digital advertising. And it is amazing to see that how fast that is developing, because global players like Heineken, Coca-Cola, they want that audience. They want to address that audience that is web savvy in those countries. And they are the first ones actually to start using those local content-driven platforms to get into the heart of the attention span of exactly that generation, again, that picks it up real fast. Challenges, obviously the issue just addressed in terms of connectivity, in terms of pricing. There's huge differences in pricing between those countries that we're into. Quite often, being active now in 2 years, I've noticed that, you know, from the techie point of view, these guys and girls we work with, they are completely up to standard compared to what we're used here. Highly innovative, web savvy. Commercially, that still quite often is an issue, and an issue with lots of cultural differences connected to it. Sometimes I'm still amazed about the fact that we've invested in 3 Kenyan companies, very web savvy, good companies, have good products. If they need to sell their product to in a B2B sphere to an older Kenyan, you just can't expect them to do the typical approach that we do, just cold calling because of the age difference. You know, that is the kind of stuff that is challenging. But having said that, and getting back to the discussion just before you raised this issue, I quite often go back to the times that we were spoiled with a 14K4 modem, and we didn't have all the connectivity in the first year or the second year, and still, you know, there was a world opening up of opportunities that really stimulated the creativity in entrepreneurs, and that is exactly what we see in Africa right now, and I think it will go very fast.
Thank you, Freddy. What's your view?
Sí, yo quisiera hacer un comentario y engancharlo con el tema anterior relacionado a móviles. In
Peru specifically, the percentage of internet users through mobile devices is approximately 6%. And in that sense, I would like to link the opportunity provided by the large number of people who have mobile devices but who do not as yet use them to access the internet, the opportunities for the role of the state as a motor or as an agent to provide all its own contents that it provides directly. In Peru and in other countries of the region, the state is an important buyer It is an important player in the economy. It has a number of services that are unique to it. That is, I can get my ID card from, I can't get it from any other institution that isn't the state, or my passport. In this regard, there's an obligation, or let's say a task, an important task to be carried out in terms of thinking about how to provide contents that are consumer focused, not by the technician who works within the state and who often designs websites with information, with websites that are loaded with technology that cannot be used from those devices. And my concern regarding mobile devices is that the state wants to start working with this, but does not change its focus to the consumer, to the user as the end point of the service. How can it carry out a migration from a service that is provided on a large screen to a mobile phone screen? The space is far more reduced, so the opportunity that is provided for would exist for all these people who have mobile phones but do not have access to the internet. If the government does not overcome this focus problem, I think, at least in our case, we will not take advantage of a very important opportunity. Regarding the second point on the challenges for the entrepreneurial community, I think in our country, in addition to our infrastructural agenda, which is well known for, we have been renewing that agenda repeatedly every year. We should have an approach based more on how to make these different stakeholders, including the government, can start working together. Within all its bureaucracy, the government has different bodies that deal in a separate manner with specific problems. Companies also attend certain needs, and civil society also. As I said before, fortunately, we have in front of us a scenario which would seem to be taking a different speed in the future, in which people with a specific idea will find a space to develop their idea in a more rapid manner. In terms of the content market, there's also quite a lot of growth. Many multinational and local companies are acquiring development and creative capacities and are working with local companies to carry out these initiatives. And fortunately, among the local players, there is value added to be contributed, not merely a business relationship based on a mere presence within the country. From regarding the mobile connection part, I think there is a challenge for the entrepreneurial community to know, in terms of knowing how to work with these different actors. That's very important, and with the state. And from the company business point of view, the knowledge that there is growth in Peru in the internet. Growth of the internet has been 8% in February. This is very important to take advantage of these opportunities with new companies that are entering the local market.
Gbenga, you have some comments? Okay. No, okay. You've mentioned a very important issue here. I think I'd like to take us back.
J'aimerais
of policymakers and regulators, particularly, and also the importance of key policies to driving, infrastructure, for example, LTE with Verizon's role, and also for facilitating the right climate for both business growth and transformation. I mean, what do you think are the right policies and contributions of policy and policymakers?
So we're in a very different world than we were even 10 years ago. Yeah. And the talk of multi-stakeholder processes, I think, is taken hold of not only the internet world, but I think the regulatory world itself. And we now have to sort out what that means. What is the governance? What is the rule of law? There was a good panel yesterday on the rule of law. What is the rule of law in this new space? When, of course, the internet itself is a technology that is cross-sectoral, right? It's in every sector. But it raises some points for me yesterday, I think, about the issues it raises for personal security, privacy, for systems security, for the ability to reach far off into places where you couldn't before without this technology, for the transformational powers that we've talked about today. So there are many more stakeholders now in a process that is no longer linear. Mm-hmm. And part of our challenge then in the policy space is to very quickly change the way we think and do policy to actually meet the demands of the modern world and of these technologies and of the stakeholders who have high demand for infrastructure, for software, for devices, for all of it, for the converged benefit that all of this brings. So what do we do? One, we need to talk a lot. And one of the good things about the Internet Society is we talk a lot. We're here to actually discuss how we reach these new governance norms. Number two, I think we try to educate ourselves and each other about how these technologies actually work. I feel like there's a lot of conversation about things that we actually don't understand. Yeah. And it's very useful in my view. I know, again, the Internet Society has done a lot to bring the engineers into the conversation. We talk about the Internet and we actually don't know how it works. We talk about networks and we actually don't know how they work. We talk about software and we don't know how it works. So understanding how the technology works and then how it's accessed by communities and people seems to me important for any government regulator to understand, because the world is very different. Once we do that, we have that conversation and we have that learning, then the question becomes, how do we come to agreement about how we're going to conduct ourselves, our own behavior, with respect to the economic issues, with respect to the social issues, with respect to what was formerly called regulation. I like not to call it regulation anymore because I think it's a wrong way to think about things. I do think there is a rule of law, and I think there are policies that need to be adopted and consensus that need to be reached about how we behave ourselves. But I think that the old notion of economic regulation with respect to our networks, with respect to these technologies, is out the window. It doesn't work anymore. It's not what's going to achieve the kind of prosperity we're talking about any place in the world. That all just presents the question and the problem. It doesn't get to the solution, but I think we're in the midst of trying to figure out what that solution is.
Okay. Michael, you want to add in?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point that Kathy was raising about this multi-stakeholder approach, and from my perspective, I work a lot with regulators all over the world, and one that has been very, very successful is the regulator in Singapore, the IDA, and the reason for that is that there are actually two parts. One is the traditional regulator, and the second is a development agency, and their mandate is to listen and talk to and respond to the top 7 industries in Singapore to help build an economic and social hub for ICT. So they're not just a regulator. They listen to the industries and they respond to them. And believe me, if a big company calls up the minister and says, I'm having trouble getting access to some lines here, it happens quickly. Where I go to other countries that don't have that approach, and I'll sit there and talk to the regulator and say, look, you really need to liberalize the gateways and introduce competition so you can get benefits. And they'll just say, well, I don't think the companies will like that very much. It'll lower their revenues. They've invested a lot. And then you say, well, you represent 4% of the economy. Why aren't you out there talking to the other 96% of the economy, the banks, the tourism, everyone that needs lower costs and needs internet access? And they just kind of look at you blankly, and from their point of view, they're correct. They're a traditional regulator, and all they care about is price and coverage, and that's easy to measure and easy to think about, but that corresponds to long distance, that corresponds to universal service, but it doesn't correspond to generating internet services and the applications that we're talking about.
Thank you very much. One last question to the panelists before we open it up to the floor and to our remote participants is about capacity. I know that most of our countries, Kenya in particular, really struggles with the issue of building capacity so that then citizens can appropriate the internet for economic and social transformation. We know that Verizon has an interest in education and human capacity, and then Usha here, Dr. Reddi here, has taught in a university. But I'd like to hear from all the other panelists, what you'd say, what is required, Usha, for companies to do so that we can increase the capacity, of our citizens to be able to appropriate the internet, and then from Kathy, what's the future for capacity building? Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
To put it very simply, I think the world has changed, and I think the way that government does its business has to change. I think the way industry does its business has to change. Let me put it more bluntly. While I was training government officials, the key Indian Administrative Service officers, and introducing them to various aspects, various case studies actually, of e-government, one of the officials said, why are you telling all of this? I will call an IT chap, and he will come, and he will design everything for me, and then I'll have it done. And I said, but that's precisely where you've gone wrong. If you have not understood that he could make a mistake because you didn't speak to him properly, that's where you'll get your problems. The same official said in a public speech a day and a half later that 80%, mind you, 80% of many of the IT, particularly e-government and ICT for development projects in India are failing. 15% are partial successes. So where is the problem? The problem is not with the technology. The problem is not with the necessarily with the service providers or with the industry. The problem lies basically in the intersections, in what we might like to call change management. That is, that all of us in a way have to learn to change the way we understand each other and change the way we do our business. And that is what the internet and that is what technology is. It's changed, it's transformed the way in which we live and we work. And the second part of my concern is that we sit here and we try to forecast and we try to anticipate what young people like her, to whom technology is part of a live social environment. We can remember a time when it was not part of our environment, But for her, it's a live social environment. It's a sine qua non. So how do we anticipate for her, based upon our old assumptions of how we do business and how we negotiate spaces for a future that we cannot foresee? Couple that with multi-stakeholder discussions, which take a lot of time. They take years, sometimes they take 2 years, 3 years before a policy is finally drafted. And what happens by the time the policy is drafted, new technologies come and made a mockery of the old draft. So, we're actually forever in a catch-up mode. We have to change the way in which we function. And for me, if I wanted to know how to design a project for young people, I would give it to the young people and say, you design it, you know what you want. You come back and tell me, and then I'll find ways of doing it for you. So it's change. Change is the only constant. Change management is what we have to do.
So the capacity issue is an interesting one. If in my view, the connection of the undersea cable to India was the game changer 20 years ago, the second most important thing was an educated workforce. And so we have 6,000 of our software engineers are sitting in Hyderabad and Chennai. These engineers were the ones who designed the set-top box for our FiOS network. Those engineers are all 30 years old. When I've gone to, I've never seen so many 30-year-olds in my life. You know, you walk in and everybody's 25 to 30 years old. They're not 19, but they're, and what's happened here? The schools in India are turning out very highly educated engineers. When there are job openings at Verizon, we have people around the block waiting to see if they can get a job there. That capacity means that companies want to invest there, are able to invest, and are able then to expand their economic activity to include this population. We saw this, and we're starting to see the same thing in Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Ghana, where the schools, where the universities are becoming richer, have more ability to turn out very highly educated students. 2 years ago, we were part of a wonderful symposium in Uganda where 5 of the East African nations came together, and all the vice chancellors, it seemed, of 50 and 70 universities to talk about how ICT can be integrated into higher education to train and turn out and have the capacity built for the very employees who I suspect are going to be in those companies when the multinationals start to hit the shores of East Africa now that there's connectivity. So that 2 things have to happen at once.
Thank you very much. We'd now like to open it up to the floor and remote participants. And I think we already have the first question here, Carlos, and then second, third, fourth, fifth. And then we'll let the panelists respond and then take the next 5. So Carlos, please.
Thank you, Alice. Nice to see you. I want to talk from the point of view of regulators who manage universal access funds, because I think it was a very good point by Michael. And the point is, how much does broadband access cost per user, and for what use? Of course, governments want to provide access, but we don't have unlimited money. I've heard that one of the most successful e-health programs in Ecuador has been to send people to their homes so that their families take care, and every 6 hours they just send an SMS to the doctor. And as we know, the width of broadband that an SMS takes is very efficient, and in some countries is very cheap. So I think this is a very good point of departure as compared to access an international point of exchange to download a video, which will take a lot of broadband. I think that universal access programs should focus on videos, but on videos that allow a teacher, the best teacher in the country, to provide a class to 100 or 1,000 children. And if this traffic doesn't go to an international point of exchange, it might be really cheap. So in our program, and the question to the panel is, in which country do you have an analysis of dollars per kilobyte per second per user? The user being a student, the user being a sick person, the user being an applicant for a driver's license or looking for an appointment with the doctor. At some point he will have to go to the doctor. I think this is the issue, because of course it's wonderful to have access to the submarine cable, but as we heard, the backhaul is going to be very expensive, and we will have to pay twice for the backhaul if our traffic, our domestic traffic, has to go up to this international point and come back again, whatever the regulator decides in terms of liberalizing the internal market. So this is a question for you. In which countries have you looked at the dollar per kilobyte per second per user? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a second question. Please don't forget to introduce yourself. There's a gentleman at the back.
I'm Ludwig Preganik. I'm with the European Internet Exchange Association, but I'm speaking for my own. So the role of Internet exchange points has been pointed out, but an Internet exchange point is but one element of the whole infrastructure. And it's essentially a facilitator. It's an enabler. You have to get the people who want to exchange traffic, you have to get them around the table. Now, if you have dominant market players, they might simply refuse to peer to exchange traffic. So how can you overcome these obstacles? You have mentioned the example of Singapore. In Kenya, it has been overcome, and East Caribbean, where the countries got together to break the monopoly of one dominant player. But which other ways do you see?
Thank you. There was another question from the gentleman behind.
David Appasamy from India. I'm coming with this question from the perspective of running a microfinance company in India, where we work in deep rural areas. Everything that we have discussed so far is either more relevant to urban areas of countries, whether it's Kenya or India, or for the young. In India, in the deeper rural areas, there are about 400 million people who are, let's say, 30 and above, who are not educated. And there are unique problems with them, and I think Usha pointed that out very well, because there are cultural barriers as well to how much they can do. The people who shoulder the responsibility for the family and for the development are women. But they are the ones who are most disenfranchised. In our effort to bring a change in their lives, we've been trying to tell them to use a mobile phone because it's a business tool. And they're not able to buy one because what will their husband say? It's a different kind of problem. So most of the husbands have phones. Then we explain to them this is a business tool. You need it. And give them examples. And then they go and negotiate with the husband. You see? Now, 20 years from now, this problem won't exist because all of the kids in those rural areas are going to school. You know, whenever we travel through the rural areas, the most heartwarming sight is to see all those kids waiting for the bus. You know it's going to change. But what about those 400 million today? How are their lives going to change? And how is the internet ever going to reach them if they can't even have a mobile phone? I think we need to have creative solutions to things like that.
Thank you. We have a question from a remote participant, and then, yeah. Remote participant.
Thank you very much. We've had a very lively discussion going on with a number of comments on the remote moderation. We have nearly 28 viewers participating from 13 ISOC remote hubs across the world for the global INET. These discussions have sort of raised some important material for the panelists, which include, for example, one participant relates that because of the internet coming to the rural part of the world, businesses are being affected negatively because they've had to close down shop in some countries, and this is relevant to European countries. There's another discussion that is actually the internet just not another tool to have resources from the meager pocket of Africa shifted to the wealthy economies? And then there's a question around that is there any measure of wealth or development based on how many people use mobile technologies? They can rather become victims of technological consumerism. Do they not think that before a child has an Android or an iPhone, that they would require literacy, consumer maturity, and education, of course, using technological tools? Another interest comes into, is entrepreneurship education the only type of education necessary? What about values, solidarity, technologies, traditional, basic literacy, etc.? Then a question from Cameroon. Does the simple fact of having a network build the possibility to contribute to improve a country's economy? And then a government-related question, which is how deeper do you think governments have to be involved in the facilitation of the use of internet when we consider the other challenges that poor countries are facing at the moment? And what percentage do you think that governments could actually, that we could actually contribute to success, to internet development or economic transformation without government collaboration? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are quite a number of questions from remote participants. I think we'll come back to you. I would like to take, because there are quite a number from the remote participants, so take those first, the first 4, 3, and then the remote. So would you like to start, Michael and Jacques, especially regarding the broadband issue and IXPs?
Okay, yeah, and I can talk to the first 2 questions with regard to the cost of providing access all the way through the network. We do have some numbers. I won't go into them, but I'm happy to provide you this report if you let me know where to send it. But we have broken down the costs, and the international is squeezed, but there's still national, where often there's dominant market power and not a lot of competition. We haven't talked about power issues, but that can add a significant amount to offering even mobile, just having to have generators and security to provide power. And then in the last mile, devices are still expensive, and there's a lot of taxes. Some governments still seem to consider the devices a luxury rather than a necessity, to put it bluntly. And I think we ignored Alice's question about whether mobile access or shared access is going to be the right model. And there's still obviously, demand curves go down. There's always going to be some people that can't afford mobile access for the time being, and shared access may be the best way to provide access to the internet, whether it's a shared mobile or a shared terminal in a cyber cafe or at the school. So I think there's always going to be some of that. So the costs are starting to come down. There's investment. The markets are working in a lot of places, but there's still obviously work to be done. And I can share you the breakdowns of the costs that we have. Just quickly on the second question with the IXPs, that's an excellent question. You can see it in Europe. In some countries, the incumbents have joined the IXP, the Netherlands, the UK. Somebody told me in the UK, BT joined the exchange, and they think it's because it was in 1995 and the engineers joined the exchange without bothering to ask the business people, who probably wouldn't have realized the significance of it anyway in 1995. But if you move forward, in Germany, in France, in Singapore, we tried to put together an exchange in Singapore. The incumbents have realized the economics and think it's in their interest to effectively keep their share of the pie rather than help the pie grow. And it's very hard if you want to keep regulation out of the internet to force that, and we do want to keep regulation out. So it's very difficult. Kenya just happens to have an incredibly cooperative model. They have multilateral peering agreements at the exchange, and it's working. Whereas in Nigeria, a few of the big operators are staying out for the reasons you described. So it's very difficult. It's a perennial challenge. But you can look at the countries in Europe, and we've done these graphs, the countries in Europe that have exchanges where the incumbent joined and everyone is peering with each other have much more international internet traffic and huge exchanges. So there's a benefit. It's just how to convince the operator that thinks they're going to lose from that to join, and that they won't lose from that.
Thanks, Jacques.
I like the first question because It's a good question, but possibly as well the wrong question, because at the end of the day, the question is not to understand the costs and necessarily the return directly. I think these are pervasive technologies, and the point is that maybe even if it's not profitable to do, let's say, video traffic type of activities, at the end of the day, the real question is the users of video traffic are likely the same as the person doing emails or doing SMS. And if you cut one part of the equation, you cannot cut the customer or the user in two pieces. Either he has access to every type of technologies to benefit from it or not. That's my first observation. Second thing is that it's very difficult to make the economics. Because again, the economics of, if you take rich media versus a basic SMS, we all know that in terms of economics of bits and bytes, de facto email going to be, or SMS going to be quite cheap. But even on the video side, it depends whether, you know, your network is full at the last mile, whether you can cache, whether it's actually good content that you can cache, whether you got typically Wi-Fi offloading, and you name it. And all that changed dramatically the economic equations. The only thing I can tell you is that, and it emphasizes the first point I wanted to make, is that as a government, much more than anything else, if you think in pure economics terms, the first thing you need to do is to enable the system, because there are just enough of evidence that the internet economy is actually additive to the growth of an economy. The second thing you have to do is not necessarily enable, but if you spend, you know, in classical expenditure term, it translates into economic activity. If you spend money in infrastructure like IT, but also in enabling new industries. And the third thing is that it's obvious that if you have different industries where there is a huge potential of transformation, you should do it whatever the cost of bits is. And again, if I look at the education, I think the return on investment, there are just so many studies trying to estimate how big that ROI is. The minimum that I've seen in all this research is ROI of 15%. Now, give me a sector, even with very high sunk costs, to still get ROI of 15% with pretty much no risk, because we know that in this case, the people will get trained and possibly will go out of the poverty trap. So to me, in this kind of ROI elements on education, like in accessibility and the like, it seems to me quite self-obvious that I just don't even care on the cost. The call option of transformation is so high, that's what I care. And maybe the government is the best, is possibly the most amenable to do these things, because again, the ROI will possibly not come into 5, 6, 7 years. So you need a discount rate of pretty much zero at this stage, but in the term of the next generation will possibly benefit and transform itself. So it's a call option game much more than anything else.
Do you mind if I jump in just 1 second here? I, like you, like to think that we're putting broadband and high-speed connectivity out there for healthcare and education. When we actually look at customer behavior, when we look at why customers actually want the connection, it's entertainment. They want to watch sports, movies, etc. That's human behavior. But if we allow that behavior to actually drive demand and investment and allow it to be priced accordingly, the other actually follows. And we see this all the time. When we see what happens, that once the capacity is out there, notwithstanding I want it so that I can look at Facebook, I then have the opportunity and to use this technology for things that we find much more in the public interest, right? So I think part of a deployment strategy is both to use it for our anchor tenants, which may well be our universities and our clinics and our hospitals, but also to understand human behavior and what people are willing to pay for and want to pay for, and allow that to happen in the private sector so that there is a return before 8 years, we hope, before 8 years on the investment, sometimes not, it's a long-term sunk investment, we know that, but that we get the return so that more capacity is used for newer things.
Thank you, Vin.
Just to complete on the entertainment, I totally agree. The interesting things about YouTube, if you look again, beside the classical entertainment, the channels that are in proportion the most often used are actually do-it-yourself channels. And that themselves, imagine that in these developing countries, people are using them as education tools or as a way to use technologies or as a way to create more usability and the like. It's a tremendous potential of growth. Now, the interesting thing is that, I'm not taking Google for the sake of Google, but the point is that those externalities are not captured by Google itself in the price point of YouTube or in advertisements. That's the thing I'm just trying to say, which is look where the positive externality will come. And video itself is a bit too easy to say it's too expensive, so we stop it, while at the same time it helps possibly doing what you, Kathryn has just developed as an argument. And the second one is also the fact that as a do-it-yourself is quite interesting. I call much more enterprise to basically use that as an effective information channels for the usability on the B2C side.
Thank you,
just a clarification. I was talking about the use of public funds. Okay.
Fair enough.
Well, most has been said already, but I can quote directly from our practice that, yes, the #1 driver, especially in our B2C investments, is entertainment. What I like very much about that part is that it's about local entertainment. We have massive uploads of local music bands, gospel choirs, and what have you that are tremendously popular. We constantly track what attracts the most eyeballs, and I'd like to share with you that in Africa, the entire issue of self-improvement is a big issue within our portals. So yes, it is about e-learning. It is about how to become rich. It is how to become a better man or father, husband, and what have you. So I think the e-learning component, also in our field of just coding, programming, the amount of self-education that we encounter in terms of the latest Java developments, it's massive.
Thank you. Gbenga?
Okay, so there was a question from the one online question about the fact that now we have internet access in developing countries, and it's having a lot of impact on jobs and all that. And I think it's just the response to that is very simple. This is the reality of disruption in an hyper-connected, in a hyper-connected world. I'm sure it's the same thing that anyone who was making typewriters would have thought about when computers were made, or Encyclopedia Britannica isn't published anymore for a certain reason. So I think it's one of those things that businesses have to work around. There are things that will disrupt, and then you have to work around it. So it's good news.
Yeah, there are several questions that I think were directed to Dr. Reddi.
Actually, there's more than, there's a little bit of each of the questions that I'd like to address. India in the 1960s went for a very ambitious space program. And there were a lot of questions asked at that time and even subsequently as to, do you invest this kind of money in science and technology and space when you have so many poor and starving people? The response to that was yes, because the purpose of the space program is ultimately to benefit those people. And today India relies extensively on space, remote sensing, for a large part of its disaster management, for a large part of even, you tell the fishermen where the fish are, in the waters. And so the trade-offs were visible much later. So one cannot argue that we cannot invest in high-end internet infrastructure because we cannot afford it at this time. We have to find ways and means of doing it because those countries that have invested have done well. Having said that, it's very difficult to calculate a per unit cost, so I won't even try to do that. But I will address the second question of the deep rural areas. I have evidence that I can share with you from 5 states in India for a survey that I conducted just a year ago. And in these 5 states, the most backward state of Odisha was included, and also Tamil Nadu. And I went into the deep areas. In Tamil Nadu, now I know the microfinance movement in India, and I also know that the movement of what we call are the self-help groups, groups of women in villages that come together for small savings. Okay? In the district of Theni, Theni, in Tamil Nadu, is an NGO called Vidiyal. Vidiyal is actually a cooperative of several self-help groups. One day, one of the members of the self-help group heard a political message on a mobile phone that said, "Vote for me." Okay? This set this woman thinking. She's not educated, she's illiterate. Absolutely illiterate. She did not have a mobile phone, she did not own one. But it set her thinking, is there some way, if they can send me this message, that I can use this mobile phone to share messages among my colleagues? So from this, taking this idea to the self-help group and to the NGO, then they went from there, the women went from there to the mobile service provider and asked him if the provider would blast one voicemail a day to this closed user group. The agreement they arrived at was the women would take little money out of this small savings and they would buy a cheap mobile phone from from Airtel, that was a company. That would be financed by a small loan from the local bank. Okay? In return, the women at the little desktop computer at the NGO's office created a little voicemail every day. One small voicemail bit of message. This was sent online via the internet to the Airtel office, and Airtel blasts a message every day, 2 p.m., free of charge. What is the message about? The message is about work available in the nearby locations under the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. It is about legal literacy or legal camps for aid for domestic violence and other things. It is about when the government official is next coming to the village, so if you have any complaints, this is the time to get your complaints redressed. So a variety of these questions. If a woman wanted or did not understand or wanted the message again, she sends the famous missed call to the NGO office. Taking into account the number of missed calls, the NGO office sends again the same message to be blasted as a new message the next day. What I'm trying to say from this and what I observed in those 15 villages in this closed user group of 5,000 is that that woman who has bought this cheap mobile phone guards it more preciously than the family jewels. Husband does not get his hands on it. He's complaining. Nobody gets their hands on it. She uses it to contact doctors. She uses it for the voicemail. So there are examples out of India, out of how these technologies have made a difference to lives. The question basically is, if we use all our theoretical understanding and go in there and design an experiment, it will fail. But if you allow the intuitive capacity of the women to design something for themselves, it worked and it's working beautifully. I'll give you all the data that I have if you would like on it. Please go and see it. The question of whether it's a replicable model, upscale to an entire India, I don't know. It's highly localized. The third point I want to make is from questions that came from the remote viewers. Most of the questions are about the political economy of the internet, and they're largely philosophical and questions of what really is political economy. I don't think we have the time to address them because it would take us 3 days of intense, contentious, acrimonious debate from various perspectives, but they're all very valid.
Thank you very much. I'll take another 5 questions. There was the gentleman at the end. Oh. One more question, I think.
Hello. I'd like to respond to the question that was, I think, asked online. Is the West, again, looking for new ways of exploiting the wealth? Let me give a short comment on that. First of all, we would love to attract more African investors in funds like the ones that we have set up. Second, for our venture capital funds, we always strive to keep a minority share within the investee companies for as long as possible. So in the end, the exits will end up in Africa. And just this morning, I got an email on a new website being launched recently with the name How We Made It in Africa, showing African entrepreneurs that really became millionaires in this space already in the past couple of years. I can recommend it. These are the guys that really profited from local solutions for local issues over the past couple of years. Wonderful examples. So, no, I don't think that question that came out of the remote public was justified.
Thank you, Vincent. Okay, we'll take other questions. The gentleman at the end, please. Introduce yourself. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I prefer to go in French. Okay.
Thank you very much. I've been listening attentively to the discussion. We've been talking about internet, mobile devices, and the potential of all of this to give Africa a boost. But this shouldn't keep us from seeing the negative aspects, the negative fallout of this development. I've come here to Geneva, and when I see when I send 2 SMSs to Benin, it costs me $1. The operators deploying the technology are pocketing this money. How can, I mean, I wanted to say hello to my wife. It was 50 cents for 1 SMS. If I call her, it'll be even worse. These are the roaming charges that my operator automatically charges to my account. Before you had to fill out a form and give your authorization for this. Now they do it automatically. And this really exhausts your credit on your phone, I can tell you that. So this is not a development boost. Another point also about development. If you call somebody and want to talk to them, and you hang up, you see that all your credit has been depleted. So the technology is great, but it doesn't take certain situations into account. If an African calls you, somebody from your village, he starts by asking how all your family is, your children, your cousins, your dog. That takes 2 or 3 minutes before he can even get to the point. So imagine how much it's going to cost. The first minute should be free, because in Africa, we have to ask how people's children are and their family. Is Pierre okay? Is Usha okay? And then we get to the point of the conversation. So the first minute should be free. We've also talked about the undersea cables. We've had them in Benin for a few years. What has really been done with this? Not to mention accidents with ships that accidentally cut the cables. And if it's not that, it's a fire that devastates the technical center. So this is what has been the result of these undersea cables in our countries, in Nigeria. Now let me give you a story from Burkina Faso. Farmer called his child, who worked in a ministry in Ouagadougou, and he was told, hang on, please hold for 1 moment. And he held the line. He never got to talk to his child. He never got to speak to his son. And at the end, it cost him 3,000. He said, I'm not paying. I didn't get to talk to my son. So technology should also take into account that when a poor farmer calls his son in the capital, he shouldn't have to hold the line and then get charged for it.
Thank you. I have Michuki, and then, the gentleman right here.
Thank you, Alice. I have two questions. The first question, I want to direct it to Vincent and Michael, and again, Kathy, you're welcome to contribute to this. So there's a question, there's a good point you made with respect to entrepreneurship, which is a fundamental component of trying to drive forth economic development. Now, however, there's a challenge to entrepreneurship, and that's the funding. What we have observed, and this has been of a personal interest to me, is that in developed countries, for you to become an entrepreneur, you already have a family and friends framework that can actually support you to be able to get into or rather to practice or to try out the entrepreneurship idea that you have. In Africa, if today I decide that for the next 12 months, I'm going to try some business idea that I have, there's a high chance that I'm going to bring, if it fails, I'll bring my entire clan down. As Dr. Usha has demonstrated that one person lifts an entire family up by just having a job. So if I try something out that doesn't work because it's entrepreneurship and it fails, then the chances are that I'll bring an entire family down. So for that reason, I am more likely to be scared of trying to be an entrepreneur because I have something that's more sustainable, also known as employment. And as a result of that, entrepreneurs will less likely emerge from this region because they will take something that's more sustainable to maintain and sustain this dependence who often and by coming in large numbers. So one thing I've observed is that the West has that advantage of a strong friends and family framework that supports them so they can easily venture out into entrepreneur innovation and such. And also in addition to that, there's something called angel funding, which really tends to boost these innovators, these entrepreneurs. We don't have that in Africa. How can we actually try to bring this kind of model into these regions so that they can actually help the entrepreneurs to accomplish some of, or rather participate in the space? My second question, it comes to the discussion on LTE, next generation infrastructure. One of the discussions we've done following the study we did on the exchange points in Kenya is we got a very strong sentiment from the operators that the cost of building the 3G networks, the 4G networks, by far much surpasses the cost of buying international capacity. And while that might be justified, it's a one-time cost or it's an ongoing cost, but I tend to feel that the recurring costs tend to be what a business tends to focus on. If you have high recurring costs, then of course it affects your bottom line. The investment is something that's recovered over time. How now, going forward, how do we find a strategic way of lowering the cost of investment on this, on building the infrastructure, the 3G infrastructure, the LTE infrastructure, because the costs are significantly higher. How can we work? What are the solutions that exist out there to help the operators build the infrastructure at low costs in terms of their own investments? They have to pull out the money, but how can that be subsidized? What solutions exist to make sure that they're able to build out this broadband infrastructure at a cost that will not make them put up the pricing when the service comes online at a much higher level so that they can recover their cost on investment? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. There's another gentleman there, and then a final question there and there.
Hi, my name is Yesha. I'm from Israel. I'm president of IZOC Israel, and I want to follow on the exchange point and actually some of the things that people said here. So we have an exchange point in Israel, and it's been very effective in actually reducing costs and speeding up things. And that leads me into a question which I think is an interesting one for the panel. As what are some of the technical means, because I see an exchange as a technical mean, to really lower the cost and enable the distribution, especially for, I don't know what's the politically correct word, but aspiring word, I will use that. For you come up with another one, I'll use it. And the reason I'm asking that is because in the Western world, where we are developing the technologies, we are not paying attention to these small things. I mean, imagine, for example, you would have like a built-in system to allow, if you're asking about a dog, then it's free. Or if the packet is educational, then it's free, but if it's entertainment, it's costing twice to offset that. What are some of the technical means we can build and we should build into the system to facilitate these new things? Because I think the West is happy with a certain level of technology, and the other side needs some other things. Thank you.
I'll take two more questions. I'm afraid we're running out of time. So the gentleman here, and then there's, because you've spoken, I'll probably give it to somebody who come last. That's the last question. Please.
Thank you. I'm Greg Wood from the Internet Society. I'm remotely moderating, so I'm passing along some comments from the participants online. We have about 30 of those. There are two themes. I think one is an observation relating to the last mile, a comment from the Pacific, which the last mile is interesting, but it's the thousands of miles between the land masses that are more difficult. The other theme is that comments about the economic indicators, which indicate what they indicate, which is things like consumption and spending, but don't measure things like what people have learned or developed or how they've improved. So related to that is the idea that while those indicators measure certain things, we should also be interested in things like education, personal improvement, and the effectiveness with which people are actually linked to knowledge. So, thank you.
Thank you. There's a gentleman at the back, please.
Thank you. My name is Jameson Olufuye. I'm an entrepreneur, that is a small and medium enterprise entrepreneur in Africa, and I also have the privilege of being the vice chair for WITSA, World Information Technology and Service Alliance for Africa. Well, I do subscribe to the questions my brother from Africa posed earlier concerning access to funding, and it's quite a big challenge in Africa. And that is why I welcome the effort of the venture capitalists, in the African ecosystem. Well, and also to say that the remote question was not necessary. I will say that I want to ask the question, and that relates to how do we ensure that those that need to hear the message of multi-stakeholder participation in policy making, they hear about it. Because I happen to be in the CSTD working group on IGF improvement, and everyone in that room agreed, both intergovernmental bodies, government, business, civil society, academic, everyone agreed that it is a perfect model, good model in setting up policy to ensure economic transformation and sustainability. So we will talk about it, like Jacques said, but how do we ensure that those people that need to hear about it, they hear about it, even as they come up with policy formulation?
Thank you. One last question here.
Jacques, you mentioned about job multiplication. Now, what kind of jobs are being created in which categories? And is the workforce ready to take on these jobs? What needs to be done in the educational level?
Thank you. Now, I would now like to welcome the panelists to respond to some of the questions. I think start with Vincent, on the entrepreneurship ones.
Yep. A very good question from the gentleman over there. How about entrepreneurship and angel funding? What we've seen, especially in Kenya and in Nigeria, is that the government or government agencies like the Kenyan ICT Board have done their utmost to promote the entrepreneurship in this field, in digital media, with examples of setting up the iHub in Kenya. You have iHubs in Nigeria, partly government stimulated, partly private sector. What you see is that, startups get low cost or office space for free, high bandwidth connectivity, lots of speakers from all over the globe. I think even Vincent Cerf went to the iHub a couple of months ago to inspire those kids. I do emphasize, in sync with your question, that part of that subsidy should be spent on actual entrepreneurial training. Now, everything is on the tech side of things, but we're talking about if these startups are really successful, their companies grow. They grow real fast. What we miss a lot is basic training in account management, marketing, finance, HR, those kinds of aspects. That is really an inhibitor to growth in these fast-growing companies. That is one of my concerns that I think could be addressed more, either by NGOs, local governments, etc. But it's connected to your second issue, angel funding. I think the best thing that could happen in these emerging economies is that the typical rich guys who have capital enough, who want to keep investing that in, tangible things like stones, bricks, fixed assets, they should get involved in funding those local startups, because then they get the business sense, the business network combined with the external venture capital, and that would really make a difference. I can give one example, a wonderful website in Kenya called Eat Out. It's basically the dining city variant for Kenya. Set up about a year ago, now highly profitable, covers about 300 restaurants or so where you can make your online reservation. Why did it grow into basically every upstandard restaurant in Nairobi connecting to it? Because the young guy setting it up is from the Indian, from a strong Indian network. So connecting all the restaurants that you need to make a website like that successful is a network thing. And that example keeps me emphasizing over and over again that we need local. There's money enough in Africa or in most emerging countries. We need local involvement and attention to make these businesses even more profitable. Getting back to one of the last questions, what kind of jobs are being created? Well, obviously, in our practice, we focus on local content, local mobile transaction platforms. We have created lots of basically coding jobs, but also lots of journalistic content editing, video editing jobs, those kinds of jobs. Yeah.
Thank you. There was a question about roaming charges and the cost of infrastructure that's direct. So Mike, Jacques, and Kathryn, if you could respond.
I don't think I'll touch roaming, but on the cost of infrastructure, to Machuki's question and to your question, I mean, you can really go through the network from the backhaul and try and reduce all unnecessary costs and promote as much cooperation as is safe in a competitive environment. So you have to get rid of the cost of putting up the towers. Sometimes some communities view that as a moneymaker, just like I was saying about devices as a moneymaker. You have to change that mind frame. Obviously, all societies, all governments have to tax, but you have to pick where to tax and where to grow. So you can share the towers. We've done studies where you can even share the devices all the way up the tower. So you're using different spectrum, but you're sharing everything on the tower. You can lower the cost of power. You can use shared cables. So there's a variety of ways, basically from the submarine cable all the way to the endpoint. If you can get the companies to cooperate and get the government to kind of move out of the way to significantly lower the cost. Again, back to the question on universal service, you won't get to every village that way. You'll have to have a universal service, but the goal is wherever it's efficient for one or more companies to deploy, they should be free to do that in the most efficient way. And the IXPs, I mean, you know as well as I do that, you know, that's an incredibly efficient way of delivering content. The costs are in the paper, but in these, you know, these are shared, non-profit IXPs that have a very low connection charge and deliver a huge amount of benefit for that charge. So I don't see where you could strip out of that. I mean, Vichuki works with the one in Kenya and worked on the paper, and, you know, it's very lean. So I don't see any way to strip out of that.
I share your frustration with roaming charges. I noted that as soon as I landed here in Geneva, that little message comes up on my phone: beware, beware, you're going to pay a lot of money. I think for companies like my own and companies around the world, that's a very bad message to be giving your own consumer, right? Beware, don't use my product, it's going to cost you too much money. I think that as the mobile revolution really takes hold, that these pricing issues are going to get sorted out because they have to. I think that there's old pricing models that are being used that are not actually in tune with the way consumers use their mobile devices, and that for us to make money, we're going to have to get in sync with that. And it may very well be, by the way, that the regulators get in the way of this. And I just want to, it sounds a little counterintuitive that in fact the regulators ought to step in and fix it. I don't actually think they can fix it. I think they'll fix it for a day, but then it'll change again. What really needs to happen is that those of us who provide the service have to be sensitive to the way our customers use the service and the way they want to use it. Now, while I think you got a little smile that said the first minute should be free because after all we need to have a greeting, I found that really quite interesting. Imagine a competitive service that said your first minute is free because we understand you need to give a greeting, and then we had a price plan that actually fit the needs of the customer. Obviously, the provider is providing service that costs money to provide. All of those costs are a lot of what we just talked about, right? The connectivity that goes from here to the United States, the long haul that we just discussed that goes from the tower back to the point of presence and the cost of that. So all of these issues that we discussed actually goes to the price of that phone call and that roaming charge. As we work through this, as we start to understand the economic benefits of not costing out our customers so they don't actually use our network, when we understand that we'd actually like you to use it, not use it, we actually don't want you to turn your phone off, I think this is going to get sorted through.
Thank you, Jacques.
Yeah, I'm going to give a few comments on each of the 5 questions very quickly. I share obviously the frustration on the first question. Statistically, when you look on a global scale, you come to a very basic conclusion on the internet. When a service has still an elasticity, a positive elasticity on the revenue, which is close to 1, you come to a conclusion the service will never be pervasive. Now you came to the, in the developed countries today, the only elasticity that matters among providers is the price elasticity, no longer the revenue elasticities. And it's good news because when there is high price elasticity, there is competition most of the time, and then price goes down, and it reinforces the loop. Now, in your market, especially with this kind of price structure that you have, and a lot of much more poorer people, that obviously not good. But strategically, even for those kind of companies, it's short-sighted because we all know when you pass a threshold, there is a big second, element of middle class that's actually going to spend in proportion much more than anything else. So the question is that who in the market will do that? And the second thing, the good news, and you know that in Africa as well, the beauty of the internet, or at least phones, we can get an access to a data feed. At the end of the day, you got applications like WhatsApp and so on, we basically can help you, going into over IP and basically bypass, obviously, the kind of price charge and the like. And you know what? In the long term, what we've seen in the internet is that if you don't basically manage to get user-friendly, you're out of market very quickly. So it does not necessarily help your bill as of today, but I guess in the long term, the things will possibly move into the right direction. That's point number one. Two, on the entrepreneurship, I really love the question because I really think as well that you separate the two questions. There is a question of funding, and at least in our own studies, we found out two elements of funding issue. The very first one is just an awareness. A lot of people are not aware of the myriad of local companies that could be successful in the venture of the internet space, simply because there are just not a lot of fora where we've got a list of these companies existing. And so when you get asymmetric information like that, it's very difficult for people to go and try to find those companies. So the first thing, I think, is also the role of the small entrepreneurs to basically aggregate themselves and making sure that the companies are pretty much known for funding and create not necessarily a marketplace, but at least an information place for that. That's what we found out in talking to a lot of people interested in seed capital or in angel funding. The second thing, and I think it was well said as well by Vincent, let's be clear, those people are not investing just at the beginning. They want an ROI, and they look at the companies 5 years down the road or 6 years down the road to get the right profile. And they all ask the same question. It's good you're good in the tech. It's good that you have a business model. Do you have the marketing? Do you have the distribution channels to scale? And that question, it's obviously an enterprise question much more than just a technical funding question. If you can promote that and show that, I guarantee you a lot of people will come. Third question, I will only take one, on the job, because it's also a question about, well, the internet is shifting a lot of jobs and so on. This is true. As I said, the internet, for one job lost, 2.6 was created in the developed world. In the US, paradoxically, for one job lost, we found out 1.1 job gain. Okay, it depends really on the countries. If you go in Israel, for instance, for one job lost, you can get up to 4. And again, in developing countries, it's much more 1 to 5. Why first this difference? Well, first of all, if you look at the US economy, there are a lot of, obviously, on the supply side, are big companies like, again, the Google, Facebook, and the like, but a lot of things are just consumed. A lot of the internet infrastructure come, from outside of the US, to be honest, and so actually the trade deficit in terms of infrastructure makes the job being obviously done somewhere else. It's not the case in countries like Israel, where everything is designed in software and infrastructure to go outside of the boundaries of the countries. Now, but the interesting things when we look by industries, and again, I haven't done the job at that level of granularity for the developing words, or aspiring words for lack of better word for that, we find out two interesting statistics. And again, that's the law of large numbers. It just center the mean of the distribution here. We found that on average, every industry, except possibly in distribution, tend to have a positive ratio of jobs versus a lost job. Second thing we find out is that industries where the exports is much more greater obviously tend to grow more in terms of jobs as well. And the third thing is that, surprisingly enough, small companies actually where the dynamic of jobs is the biggest, and we start to see at the middle, so the high end of a small medium enterprise, where the point is neutral, is 0. And that's the key challenge, because Alvarian's, Google's chief economist, always say we start seeing new type of companies coming. And they're not the classical multinational. We see the micronationals, or whatever for a type of word, which are very small companies exporting very quickly, going directly into, but when they come to a size of 100 to 200 FTEs, type of size of employments, what we see, this company gets stuck, and they don't grow anymore, and they start obviously being restructured. The challenge of resilience in the economy is to make sure that those companies start to move to the next wave of industrialization. That's the challenge of Europe. That's not the challenge of the US. And it's likely to be a challenge in the future of Africa and aspiring countries.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I can see Karen is coming up to. Yes, so I would like to take this opportunity to first thank the panelists very much for your very vibrant contributions, to thank all the participants that are here today and our remote participants as well. And I think we'd also all like to congratulate and thank the Internet Society, our host, and special thanks to Karen Rose and John Coffin for having organized this panel. And for me, it's actually been a great honor to moderate such a distinguished panel. And thank you all once more.
Thank you.
Back to Karen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Alice, for all of your work in moderating the session, and to our fantastic panelists. I think this panel discussed a very wide range of issues relating not only to economic growth, but then why do we look at economic growth? Because it also brings social benefits. And I think we looked at both sides of that spectrum. But just some housekeeping notes. Right now we can go to lunch, which is between 12 and 13:30. And then I'd also invite everyone here to our closing roundtable, which will be in the plenary room, room 1, from 13:30 to 15:30. And then from 15:30 to 16:30, we have our closing keynotes. And our keynote speakers to close the global INET include Mitchell Baker, Francis Gurry, and Vince Cerf. So I'd invite you to the roundtables and the events of this afternoon. Thanks again to our panel, and thank you very much for your participation. Really diverse, and there was a lot of perspectives on it.
Exactly. No, it was really good. It was very well put together.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was